Fort Kearny, Nebraska. In the bitter winter of 1871, what would you do if fear turned your neighbors against you? When a widowed mother takes in orphaned children marked by fire? Not disease. The town demands they be cast out. Would you stand by mercy or yield to fear? What hidden truth could turn suspicion into salvation? Stay with this story, because what happens inside that cabin will test the heart of an entire frontier town. And you, what choice would you make? Welcome to WestDream Tales, the channel where forgotten frontiers come alive. Here, we bring you stories of love, courage, and survival from the Wild West, told with heart and history. Every tale is a journey through dust, fire, and redemption. Don't just watch, be part of the ride. Subscribe now, hit the bell, and join us as we uncover the legends that shaped the West. It was the winter of 1871, on the edge of the frontier at Fort Kearny, Nebraska Territory. The plains lay frozen under a pale moon, the wind carrying sharp flakes of snow across the empty land. That night, the silence broke with the angry shouts of men and the crackle of torches. Flames swayed in the storm, painting long, shifting shadows across a weather-beaten cabin at the far end of the fort. Inside, the wooden walls trembled under the force of fists pounding at the door. Each strike echoed through the small space, mingling with the cries of frightened children. Clara Hensley stood at the center of it, a shotgun gripped firmly in her hands. Her breath steamed in the dim lamplight, her face pale but set with resolve. Behind her, 5 children clung to one another, their small bodies shaking from cold and fear. Clara Sheriff Cole, Danner's voice bellowed over the storm. "You can't keep them here. If you don't open this door, we'll burn this place to the ground." Lydia, Clara's own daughter, pressed her face into her mother's skirt. One of the orphans whimpered, and Clara bent slightly, resting her hand on his tangled hair. The touch was gentle yet fierce, a promise carved deeper than words. Outside, the flames roared higher. The snow glowed orange under torchlight, the sound of boots crunching nearer. Clara lifted the shotgun, her arms steady despite the hammering of her heart. Her voice cut through the door like steel. "If you want them, you'll have to step over my body first." For a heartbeat, the night fell silent. Only the hiss of wind across the prairie and the faint sobs of children filled the air. The men outside shifted uneasily, their resolve shaken in the glow of fire. Clara stood unflinching, her back pressed to the door, and as the storm raged beyond the cabin, her mind was pulled back to the day, 2 weeks earlier, when everything began along the Platte River. The winter of 1871 laid a white hush over the Platte River. Frost sealed the water in pale glass and stilled the grass to brittle wire. Smoke hung low where homes had burned, as if grief refused to lift. Clara Hensley walked with Lydia along the riverbank, their boots crunching in the crusted snow. The fort lay behind them like a tired breath on the plain. Ahead, the land opened wide, empty and echoing. The sound reached them first, as a thin thread on the wind. It was not timber groaning or wolves calling across the flats. It was crying, thin and human, impossible to ignore. They followed it to a farmhouse that had burned to its frame. Beams leaned like broken ribs, and the doorway yawned without a door. Ash lay in drifts against the stoop, sprinkled with bits of glass that did not shine. A boy staggered out from the wreckage. He looked to be 8, though hunger had taken height from him. Soot streaked his face, and one coat sleeve hung burned to the cuff. 3 figures moved behind him in the gray light. A girl held a scorched rag doll to her chest, the doll's hair gone and one glass eye cloudy. A smaller boy clung to her, coughing into the crook of his sleeve. The last child, hardly steady on her feet, gripped the girl's skirt with both hands. Their faces were hollow and set. Red patches marked their skin where heat and smoke had scalded it. From the ridge came voices that did not come down. Settlers stood with collars up and scarves tight. The words rolled out hard as stones. They bear the marks. Someone called, "Do not touch them." "Clara." Another voice cut through the wind. "Let the prairie take them before the fort must bury more." Lydia pressed close to her mother's side. Her breath came in short plumes and her eyes shone with worry. Clara felt the small hand find her coat and hold fast. Clara crouched and looked at the nearest boy. She watched his breath, counted the rise and fall. She checked the inner wrist for blisters and the corners of the mouth for sores. Only soot, only cold. No fever glassed his eyes, and no new rash lifted the skin to painful islands. Clara let out the breath she had been holding. She unwound her wool shawl, slow and careful. She wrapped it twice around his shoulders so cloth met cloth and not skin. She tied a kerchief over her mouth and nose, the linen damp with vinegar from the bottle she kept in her satchel. "Come with me," she said, keeping her voice even. "You are safe now." The words were simple, and the boy leaned into them as if they were heat. The girl with the doll did not move. She held the toy tighter and shook her head once. Clara reached into the satchel again and drew out a folded blanket. She held it open with both hands. "No one will harm you," she said. "Not while I'm here." Her eyes stayed on the girl's eyes until the shaking stopped. The girl stepped forward, and the two younger ones came with her. Lydia shifted, then reached out a gloved hand to steady the smallest child when she slipped. A brief touch passed between them, like a thread tying strangers to kin. Clara looked up at the ridge. The men and women up there stayed where they were, their faces tight against the wind. Fear held them in place, as firm as iron. Clara found an old sled plank half buried beside the shed ruins. She lashed it with spare rope and made a low drag for small feet. She spaced the children along it and kept Lydia beside her on the walk home. The wind came straight down the river and cut their cheeks raw. Clara's coat shielded the boy, who wore her shawl. The plank creaked and hissed over the snow. When the cabin showed through the thin trees, Clara did not go to the front door. She led them to the side shed, where tools had once hung on pegs. She pushed the door wide with her hip and waved the children inside. A chalk line went down on bare boards, straight as she could make it. She hauled water and set it to boil in an iron pot. She scrubbed the floor with lye until her fingers burned. Lydia carried kindling and stacked it with a care far older than her years. The children watched the pot steam and the fire swell. Their eyes followed every motion of Clara's hands. The smallest boy began to shiver in hard, steady jerks. Clara wrapped another blanket around him and pressed him close through layers. Her cheek turned away, but her voice came warm near his ear. "You will have a bed," she said, "and a fire that will not go out." The words steadied the boy until his shivers broke into tired sleep. By dawn, the story had run ahead of them. It slipped through the fort before the sun could catch it. People remembered small graves in frozen ground and fresh mounds near the cottonwoods. Red marks, seen from a distance, became proof. A cough carried on wind became sentence. The name Clara Hensley turned from respect to warning, whispered on doorsteps. Sheriff Cole Danner came at dusk, his hat crusted with frost. He stood on the threshold and did not cross it. His eyes flicked from Clara's face to the children behind the chalk line. "You know what they say," he began, voice low. "The sickness has not finished its work. If you keep them here, the fort could fall." Clara held his gaze. Firelight made her features steady rather than soft. "They had no one," she said. "If I leave them, they die tonight." The sheriff's jaw worked and then went still. For a breath, he looked older than his years, like a man who had dug too many graves. "God help you," he said, and the wind took him back into the dark. The days that followed grew thin around the edges. Cornmeal stretched with water, beans counted out with care. Clara cut her own portion to a sliver and pretended to chew. The children ate with both hands and said little. Lydia broke her bread to share without being asked. At night, she leaned into her mother's side beneath a single quilt, her breath finding Clara's rhythm and keeping it. Work came in from the fort in small bundles, torn trouser knees, a ripped coat seam from a cavalryman. Clara stitched by lamplight until her eyes watered. She boiled linens in the yard on days the wind did not roar. She burned rags that could not be saved. She kept vinegar in a shallow bowl near the door. Now and then the smallest child woke in the dark and cried. Clara rose without sound and went to her. She rubbed small shoulders through the blanket and laid a hand against a small back until breath steadied. Samuel's cough began in the second week. It came dry and sharp at first, then lower, then deep enough to wake the house. Each time, the sound broke past the shutters and into the yard. Neighbors heard and drew their coats tighter. The sound pulled fear back to the surface like a hook through skin. Proof. Someone said outside the store, "Hear it and know." Clara mixed herbs the way her mother had taught her. She steeped the cloth and pressed it to Samuel's chest. She counted his breaths until her own came even again. Lydia knelt beside the bed and took Samuel's hand in both of hers. "Do not leave," she said in a voice that trembled and held. Samuel's fingers tightened as if he understood. By the third night, Samuel's forehead burned hot under Clara's palm. His breath came fast and shallow, and his eyes rolled with the fever dream. Snow hissed against the window like whispered warning. Clara stood and pulled on her boots. She tied the vinegar cloth at her face and buttoned her coat to the throat. She saddled her horse in the yard by feel more than sight. Lydia's voice followed her into the storm. "Come back," she said, small and fierce. Clara laid a gloved hand on her daughter's cheek and held it there for a heartbeat. Warmth moved from skin to skin and steadied them both. Elm Creek lay a long ride east with the wind in a woman's face. The river ran beside her as a line of black through white. The horse blew clouds from its nose and the saddle creaked in time with Clara's breath. She found the clinic with a lamp glowing behind frosted glass. Dr. Elias Moore looked up from a ledger at the sound of the door. Frost had painted Clara's hair in bright white. "Please," she said, leaning on the counter to keep from falling. "A boy is dying." The words were simple and not dramatic, and they carried the weight of a house on them. The doctor's caution and the town's rumor moved across his face and passed. He took his bag and his heavy coat. He nodded once and followed her back into the night. The ride home blurred to white and wind. Twice the horse stumbled and twice found its feet again. Clara fixed her mind on the boy's face, the way a traveler fixes on a star. At the cabin, Dr. Moore hung his coat, rolled his sleeves, and set the kettle to boil. He worked with clean hands and simple tools, quiet in his movements and sure. Bitter liquid went past Samuel's lips in small sips. Hours gathered and fell. The storm drove against the shutters, and the lamp flame bent and straightened. Clara sat with Samuel's hand in hers and did not move unless the doctor told her to move. Lydia leaned against her mother and did not sleep. When she swayed, Clara drew her closer and set a light kiss at her temple. The touch did not fix anything, but it kept them steady. Near dawn, the fever broke on Samuel like a wave that had been waiting. Sweat ran cool where heat had burned. His eyes opened to a thin thread of light between curtain and sill. Clara's sob came quick and soft. She brushed damp hair from his brow and pressed her lips to his skin. He turned toward the sound of her voice and stayed. Doctor. Moore sat back and breathed out a piece of the night. He will live, he said, but this is not over. His eyes went to the door as if trouble had a shape and stood just beyond it. By noon, the story had changed again. The cough had grown in the telling. The marks had spread over every inch of skin in rumor. Men who had not heard Samuel breathe swore they had. Clara boiled the linens again and opened the shed door to let the air move through. She chalked a fresh line on the floor, though the old one had not faded. She kept the children busy with small work that made them useful and proud. The girl with the doll sat very still and watched Dr. Moore pack his bag. In the quiet of the room, the doll's dress turned and showed a small brass button sewn near the hem. A faint eagle lay stamped there, worn to a blur by time and fingers. Dr. Moore paused as if a thought had crossed his path, and he had felt the wind of it. He did not speak it. He tied the bag strap and gave instructions for broth and rest. When he left, Clara walked with him to the yard. The snow squeaked underfoot, and the cold bit at her cheeks. She thanked him in a voice that carried all that could fit into 2 words. He nodded and put a hand to the brim of his hat. "Keep the fire," he said, "and keep the door barred at night." His gaze moved to the horizon as if he could see a gathering. That evening, Clara set 1 more log on the fire and counted the loaves left on the shelf. Lydia brought in chips from the woodpile and stacked them with care. The smallest child fell asleep, with her hand still on the edge of Clara's skirt. The night stretched long and thin. Wind rattled the eaves, and sometimes a footstep sounded where there was nothing. Clara listened with her head turned to the door and her back warm with the heat of small bodies. Toward morning, the sky lifted from black to iron gray. Smoke rose from a few chimneys at the fort and hung there without much heart. Somewhere a rooster tried the cold air and gave up. Clara washed her hands in water that steamed and cooled. She tied her hair back with a strip of cloth and looked around the room. In the lamplight, the faces of the children smoothed to peace. Red patches had faded where fear had named them wrong. The cough that had called judgment was quiet in sleep. Truth in that hour had a small voice, but it was true. By the 3rd day, Clara took in more mending and traded a coil of rope for dried apples. She mixed the apples into a thin pie and baked it slow. The smell reached every corner of the shed and drew smiles to faces that had forgotten how. Lydia laughed once, bright and quick. Clara turned at the sound as if a bird had flown through the door. She tucked a loose strand behind Lydia's ear and let her hand rest a breath longer than needed. At dusk, voices drifted from the road again. They did not stop this time, only passed like a weather front with talk hung from it. "Watch that house," someone said. "She has brought death back." Clara stood very still until the sound was gone. She closed the bar across the door and checked the window latch with 2 fingers. Then she sat with her back to the wall and watched the fire bank down. The children slept in a row, small breaths rising and falling like the tide. Lydia's head lay on Clara's thigh, and a warm weight settled over both of them. Outside, ice creaked on the river and went silent. The prairie waited, holding its breath under frost. Fort Kearny waited with it, the fear inside its timbers like a second winter. In the narrow room, Clara kept the fire and kept the watch. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, a man saddled a horse and turned it toward the fort. Snow brushed the rider's coat and clung to a brim pulled low. The track he made on the prairie would lead straight to Clara's door. The wind eased after the last storm, but the fort did not breathe easier. Men on the boardwalk kept their hands in their coats and their eyes on the road. Women crossed the street when Clara came through with a pail. At the pump, the handle squealed loud enough to draw glances from porches. Clara worked it steady while Lydia held the tin cup for the younger ones. The water came up clear and cold, and the sound of it in the bucket felt like a small prayer, answered. Back at the cabin, the shed smelled of wood smoke and bread crust. Anna sat near the hearth with her scorched doll, humming under her breath. Samuel dozed on a pallet, his cough thin now, his chest moving like a steady tide. Clara fed the fire and checked the pot for stew. She touched Samuel's brow with the back of her fingers and let out a breath when it came away cool. Lydia leaned into her side a moment, an easy weight that steadied them both. By afternoon, a whisper grew into a rope of talk that pulled neighbors to fences. Someone claimed a stray calf had fallen sick near the river. Someone else swore the mud at the public well did not freeze right and called it a sign. At dusk, a crude circle of chalk appeared on the road before Clara's gate. No one admitted to drawing it, but everyone knew what it meant. Keep out what you fear, and let symbols do the work you will not. Clara scraped the circle away with the back of a shovel. She did not look up at the windows that watched her. The children peered from the shed, the lamplight warm on their faces, while the sky went iron gray. That night, men gathered on the far side of the path where the cottonwoods stood. Their breath plumed in the cold, and their boots made shallow scars in the snow. They spoke of a committee to keep the fort clean, a word that fit in the mouth too easily. Sheriff Cole Danner found them there and held them with a look. He did not raise his voice, and he did not need to. The men broke apart like frost under a noon sun, but their talk did not melt. In the morning, Clara traded mending for a sack of barley and 2 carrots. The storekeeper counted the stitches on a soldier's coat, as if each one might carry a price. He slid the barley across the counter without touching her hand. Best keep to your own, he said, eyes on the ledgers, for a time. Clara nodded once and left before her voice could show on her face. She took the long way back and past the schoolhouse. Children's voices lifted from inside like birds before snow. Lydia slowed, looking through the window glass, and Clara rested a hand on her shoulder until the ache passed. At noon, Dr. Elias Moore knocked at the shed door with his bag in his hand. He set it on the table and warmed his fingers by the fire without taking a chair. The room went quiet around him, the kind of quiet that listens. He checked Samuel with practiced touch. Ear bent over the boy's breathing. He counted, nodded, and told him to drink broth, slow and often. Then he turned to the little girl with the doll and studied her face in the lamplight. Anna looked back without fear, one thumb rubbing the doll's cloth arm where a brass button held the hem. The button's eagle lay worn, but still proud. Moore did not remark on it. He only sat back as if the air had changed. Keep the room aired, he said, binding a packet of herbs with twine. Boil water each morning. I will return in 2 days. Clara thanked him and walked him to the yard. On the path, he paused with his hand on the top rail. Sheriff will be pressed, he said. Folks want decisions they can point to. Sometimes the wrong ones are the easiest to point at. Clara met his gaze, and he tipped his hat and rode off toward the fort. The next night, wood went missing from Clara's pile. A string of footprints ran to the road and then turned to a ragged line where men had scattered. Clara stacked the remaining pieces tight against the wall and barred the door from within. Samuel woke and coughed, and Clara was there with the cloth and the patient hand. She lifted him enough to sip and lowered him back. The quilt pulled to his chin. When his eyelids settled, she smoothed the hair at his temple with her knuckles. Toward dawn, a lantern moved along the fence outside like a restless star. The light halted at the gate and stood there, throwing long bars against the snow. Lydia stirred from sleep and sat up without speaking. Clara rose and stood by the window with her palm against the frame. She did not breathe for a long count of heartbeats. When the lantern moved on, she came back and lay with Lydia tucked into the circle of her arm. By midday, the fort buzzed with a new fear. Someone had nailed a notice to the side of the church, calling for a meeting of householders to discuss sanitary measures. The word drew men from stables and women from wash lines, and it drew Sheriff Danner to the steps. Clara stood at the edge of the crowd with Lydia's hand in hers. Dr. Moore arrived late, coat flowered with frost, and took a place beside the sheriff without asking. The pastor smoothed the notice with his palm and cleared his throat until the talk went still. Voices rose, each one shaped like a worry carried too long. A drover swore his cough had worsened since Clara brought the children in. A woman said she dreamed of red blotches and woke to find her baby flushed. Sheriff Danner held up a hand and let quiet fall by weight, not by force. "We will act with sense," he said. "No burning, no driving folks out." Someone scoffed, but no one stepped up to name himself. Dr. Moore spoke when the sheriff finished. He chose words like tools and used them without waste. "I have examined the children," he said. "They show no signs of contagion. Burns and smoke will mark a face. Fear will finish the rest." He did not look at Clara. He did not need to. He looked at the button on the pastor's sleeve, at the iron belt rope, at the snow sliding down the eaves. "If illness comes," he added, "it will come the way it always does, by wind, by water, by chance, and not because a widow boiled linens at dawn." The crowd shifted as if a stiff board had bent in the middle. Some faces eased, others hardened, unwilling to trade fear for fact. The notice fluttered on the nail, its corners lifting like wings that could not fly. When the meeting broke, a man in a wool cap muttered that words would not keep a town alive. He kicked snow off the step and went toward the saloon without looking behind him. Another followed, and another, and their boot marks crossed each other like tangled rope. Clara walked home with Lydia, passing the blacksmith's shop. Sparks jumped at the mouth of the forge and died there, lazy and brief. A horseshoe lay cooling on the anvil, like a crescent moon cut from iron. Inside the shed, the air felt warmer than it should for the small fire in the stove. Anna had spread the doll's dress on her knee and sewn a new hem with thin blue thread. Samuel raised his head and smiled once before sleep caught him again. Clara rinsed her hands and set to kneading dough. The lean loaf grew under her knuckles and took shape with steady presses. Lydia dusted the board and wiped it clean in little circles that gleamed. Near evening, hoofbeats sounded on the road and did not pass. Sheriff Danner dismounted and tied his reins to the post with a motion that spoke more of habit than hurry. He stood at the door with his hat in his hand and the cold on his face. "May I come in?" he asked, and Clara nodded. He took the chair by the door and held it like a shield he did not mean to use. "I need to ask for patience," he said, "from you and from the town. I may not get it from either." Clara waited, hands folded in the apron where flour dust turned them pale. Lydia stood near the stove and watched the door the way small animals watch the sky. But Samuel slept without moving. "There's talk of a quarantine," Danner went on. "Nothing written, just talk." He looked up at Clara with something like apology in it. I mean to keep it that way. Clara thanked him without using the word. She poured coffee into a tin cup and set it on the table. He warmed his hands around it and did not drink. When he left, the sky was dark enough that the snow gave back its own light. Clara watched him ride off until the sound faded. Then she latched the door and stood there a breath, forehead against wood, until her heart found its pace. 2 nights later, the sanitary committee came with lanterns and long faces. They stood beyond the fence and called her name as if distance could make them clean. Their torches set the cold air moving in hot veils. Clara stepped out with the shotgun broken open across her arm. She did not lift it. She did not need to. A man in the front pointed at the shed and at the children lying like sparrows on the bench. "We'll take them to the barracks," he said, "till spring." He made the words sound like mercy. "Barracks are cold stone," Clara said, "and fear is colder." The man's mouth twitched, and he shifted his grip on the lantern pole. From the road, another voice spoke, lower and steadier. "Doctor." Moore moved into the torchlight without haste. He took the pole from the man's hands and planted it upright in the snow. A stake instead of a weapon. "Enough," he said. "You want sense. I'll give you sense. The widow keeps a cleaner house than most of you keep your prayers." Laughter tried to start and failed. The men held still under it. Clara felt Lydia's fingers slide into hers. Heat ran from palm to palm and quieted the tremor in her wrist. Samuel stirred behind them and settled again. Moore looked past the men toward the barracks roofline. "I have seen pest houses," he said. "They are places where fear goes to prove itself right." He let the words sit where they fell, then added, "You will leave them where they are." The men did not break at once. It took a long silence and a single step from the sheriff, who had come without being seen. When he drew up beside Moore, the crowd remembered it had other places to be. They went away in 2s and 3s, and the road took them like a river takes twigs. The last lantern bobbed over the rise and dropped out of sight. The night settled back onto the yard. Inside, the stove ticked the way iron does when it breathes. Anna folded the doll's dress along the new hem and smoothed it with her palm. The brass button caught the firelight and threw a small gleam against the wall. Moore watched the flicker and narrowed his eyes. The eagle on the button sat with wings half spread, a design he had cut from canvas with his own knife years ago. He did not say the memory out loud. He let it move through him and settle where it would not spill. In the morning, he rode to the fort's storehouse and asked for the quartermaster's books. He turned pages with frost-stiff fingers until he found a requisition for dress trim from a year when the war still shaped every list. Names stood in rows beside items that went to wives and widows as the army pulled east. One name made him stop and press the page flat with both hands. He read it again and saw a face that had not aged in his mind. He closed the ledger and thanked the clerk and stepped back into the cold without feeling it. At the blacksmith's, he asked for an old trunk where a dead sergeant's things had slept through 3 winters. He found a scrap of ribbon and a photograph on thin card, the kind that fades early and looks back forever. The woman in it wore a dress with brass buttons on the hem. Moore tucked the card inside his coat and rode out. Snow squeaked under the horse's shoes like mice running in the walls. He did not gallop. He carried the weight of the picture the way a man carries a full cup. Clara saw him coming and met him at the fence. He did not hand her the card. He only asked for Anna to bring her doll and stand in the light. Anna came with the doll, held out like a question. Moore knelt so their eyes met level. He touched the button and turned it between forefinger and thumb until the eagle faced up. "Where did you get this?" he asked. and his voice surprised him with how gentle it came. Anna frowned a little and pointed toward the bundle she had been found with, a bundle that had burned around the edges but not at its heart. Clara watched the doctor's face and saw recognition move across it like a shadow under cloud. She put a hand on Anna's shoulder and felt the small bones and the warm life under her palm. The feeling rose in her like courage. That afternoon, word ran ahead of dusk that the committee would try again. They meant to bring a cart from the barracks and a roll of canvas. They meant to lift what they feared and move it where they would not have to see it. Clara cleared the table and set the children's cups in a row, as if preparing for a guest. She laid Lydia's cloak on the peg by the door and tied her own shawl snug. Samuel sat up and took 2 careful breaths, like a boy learning to swim. When the first lantern showed down the road, Clara felt the old ache in her chest and let it pass. She moved the shotgun from its place on the pegs and held it broken across her arm. She checked the latch once and the bar twice. Outside, the sound of boots came like rain across a roof. Men filled the path with their bodies and the air with their heat. The cart stood at the gate with its bed empty and its canvas roll tight as a promise. Sheriff Danner stepped into the yard beside Moore before the men had time to speak. The sheriff did not draw a pistol. Moore did not carry one. "Turn back," Danner said, and the words went out quiet and strong. "You will not cross this rail." A murmur rose and went flat. Moore took something from his coat and held it in the lantern glow. It was the faded photograph, the edges scrolled where fingers had worried them. The brass button in Anna's hem winked once as if answering. "This child is not yours to seize," Moore said, "nor is any child who sleeps under a roof and by a fire." He did not explain what the picture meant, or to whom. He let the truth be a shape the eye could see and the mind could not fully catch. On the porch, Clara stood with Lydia close at her side. She felt the small hand slip into hers and tighten. Warmth moved across their joined palms like a current that does not show on the surface. The men at the front shifted, 1, then 2, like cattle that feel wire and think better of pushing it. Someone cursed under his breath, and someone else shushed him without meaning to. The cart creaked where no one had touched it. Snow began to fall in slow flakes, big enough to see. They turned in the light and came down without hurry, settling on hats and shoulders and mustaches. The night smelled of iron and pine and something like clean. A long moment held the yard. Then a man near the gate lowered his lantern, and another did the same. The cart's driver climbed down and brushed snow from his sleeve and looked at the ground. They went the way men go when they have to admit the road does not end where they thought. The canvas stayed rolled. The cartwheels left shallow tracks that filled as the flakes thickened. Clara let out a breath she had not known she was holding. She did not lean against the door. She stayed upright and counted the last footsteps as they faded. Lydia wrapped both arms around her waist for a heartbeat and then stepped back as if nothing had happened. Inside, the stove threw a calm heat, and the loaf on the shelf cooled to a crust that sang when tapped. Anna smoothed the doll's dress and pressed the button flat with her thumb. Samuel turned on his side and slept without coughing. "Doctor..." Moore set the photograph on the table face down. He rested his hand on it a moment, as if to keep it from slipping back into the past. "Tomorrow," he said, mostly to himself. "We will put the right names in the right places." Sheriff Danner lifted the bar and closed the door against the weather. "Tomorrow," he echoed, though he knew that nights like this make liars of plans. He touched the brim of his hat to Clara and stood a breath longer than he needed. The snow deepened, taking noise out of the world. The fort's lights dimmed one by one until the whole plain felt like a held breath. In that pause, the cabin stood bright and small and unafraid. Moore looked once more at Anna, at the angle of her jaw and the color of her eyes, and understood what the eagle had tried to tell him. He would have to speak it aloud soon, and to the right man, and at the right door. For now, he let the picture say what it could. Clara banked the fire and drew the quilt to Samuel's chin. She kissed Lydia's hair and felt the girl's small laugh rise under her lips like a bird. She sat a moment with her palms flat on the table, hands quiet, heart working strong. Outside, the cart's tracks blurred and vanished as if they had never cut the snow. The canvas lay tied and useless in a corner of the yard where no one would see it from the road. The night closed over the shed like a hand cupped against the wind. Far off. A bell at the fort struck once and then again, slow and even. It did not call a warning, and it did not call a fire. It marked the hour, and without meaning to, marked the line between fear and what holds against it. When the last echo faded, the house was a circle of breath and heat and sleeping children. The world outside could wait its turn. The storm was not over, but it had broken on this threshold and spent itself there. Snow lay heavy across the parade ground by the first week of January. The flag at Fort Kearny snapped in the north wind, its rope clinking sharp against the pole. Soldiers hunched their shoulders and moved quick between barracks, their eyes sliding toward the road that led to Clara's cabin. Clara rose early each day, breaking ice from the bucket, tending to the stove, and setting loaves in thin pans. The children moved with her in quiet rhythm, Lydia fetching wood, Anna brushing crumbs from the table, Samuel sitting up longer before his cough pulled him down again. Their movements made the cabin feel whole, though the air outside bristled with unrest. Rumors carried faster than smoke. Some claimed Clara had hidden more children in the shed. Others said Dr. Elias Moore lied about his examinations, covering plague for his own reasons. The talk had grown teeth, and those teeth pointed toward her. One evening, Clara stepped onto the porch with a lantern in her hand. She saw shapes on the ridgemen standing silent, their hats pulled low. They did not move closer, but their presence weighed as if a verdict had already been written. She closed the door softly and barred it. Inside, Lydia pressed against her side, whispering, "Will they come tonight?" Clara brushed the girl's hair back, her palm resting at her temple. "Not while we keep the fire," she answered. The simple touch steadied them both. The following morning, a knock shook the door. Sheriff Danner stood there, his face carved by sleeplessness. Behind him, Dr. Moore waited, his eyes holding more than he could say. "There will be a vote," Danner said. "The townsfolk have called it. They want the children moved before the thaw." Clara's jaw tightened, but her voice was even. "And you? Will you stand with them?" Danner removed his hat, snow melting down the brim. "I will stand with what is right. But right is hard to name when fear writes the tally." The meeting was set for the church that evening. Candles flickered against whitewashed walls, shadows lengthening over worn benches. The pastor opened with prayer, though his voice shook. Men and women filled the pews, their whispers a restless sea. Clara sat near the back, Lydia's hand clasped in hers, Anna beside her with the doll. Samuel slept in Dr. Moore's care, bundled in blankets near the stove. Sheriff Danner took the front, his badge dull in the lamplight. Voices rose, each heavy with anger or grief. A farmer shouted that his brother had died in the last outbreak. A woman clutched her shawl tight, claiming she dreamt the rash spreading over her child. The air thickened with dread more than reason. Then Dr. Moore stood. He placed a faded photograph on the lectern. The image showed a soldier's family husband in uniform, wife in plain dress, and a child no older than 3 with eyes the same gray-blue as Anna's. Gasps rustled through the pews. This girl, Moore said, nodding toward Anna, is not plague's messenger. She is the daughter of Sergeant Matthew Calloway, who gave his life near Wilson's Creek. He entrusted me, before his last breath, to watch over what family he left. Clara felt Anna lean into her side, the weight small yet fierce. Lydia wrapped her arms around her mother's waist, seeking strength and touch. The room shifted, uncertainty cracking its shell. But one man rose, fists clenched. A name doesn't break a fever. He spat. A picture doesn't keep a town alive. We'll not wait for sickness to prove us fools. His words ignited murmurs, hot and dangerous. Danner's hand rested on his holster, though he did not draw. There will be no mob justice, he warned. Not while I wear this badge. His voice held steady, yet the crowd pressed against itself like cattle before a stampede. Clara rose slowly, her voice carrying without force. You see burned skin and hear a cough, and you name it death. But I see children who have survived fire, hunger, and winter's teeth. If you cast them out, you will not be burying sickness. You will be burying your own mercy. Her words met silence, the kind that balances on a blade's edge. Then Anna stepped forward, clutching her doll. The brass button on its hem caught the candlelight, flashing once like a signal. It was small, but it broke the hush. A woman in the front pew began to weep, her shoulders shaking. The man beside her touched her arm and lowered his head. One by one, others followed, their anger softening into shame. The twist came not in victory, but in the fragile stillness that followed. Fear had not vanished, but it had been named, and naming it left it weaker. The vote never happened. Sheriff Danner struck the notice from the church door with the flat of his hand. Dr. Moore gathered the photograph, his eyes meeting Clara's with a quiet promise the fight was not over, but they were no longer alone. That night, the cabin glowed like a beacon on the prairie. Lydia leaned into Clara's arm as they sat by the stove. Anna fell asleep with her head on Clara's lap, her doll clutched close. Samuel stirred once, whispering her name, and Clara pressed her lips to his brow. Outside, the snow eased, and the sky cleared to a spread of stars. The storm had not ended, but for the first time, it felt like they might endure it together. By late January, the snow began to soften at the edges. Ice cracked along the Platte, sending faint echoes downriver. The fort stirred with slow relief, but the shadow of what had almost been a fire, a purge, still lingered in the silence of its streets. Clara carried water from the pump, her shawl drawn close, Lydia walking steady beside her. The girl had grown quieter in the past weeks, her gaze older than her years. Each time her hand slipped into Clara's, the touch said more than words could. Inside, the cabin held warmth that winter could not touch. Samuel slept longer now, his cough gentler, his breath even. Anna spread the doll's new hem across her lap and smoothed the fabric as if keeping watch. The brass button caught the firelight, flashing reminders no one could ignore. Dr. Elias Moore came often, though he did not always bring his bag. Sometimes he stood by the stove, silent, his eyes on Anna. Other times he spoke of names, of ledgers, of men buried under markers, half lost in snow. Each word felt like he was threading pieces of a past he could not let slip away. One evening, Moore placed the faded photograph on Clara's table. He turned it toward her, his hand resting there a moment longer than needed. "This is the family Sergeant Calloway left behind," he said. His voice did not waver, though his eyes carried the weight of years. Clara studied the picture. The child's face, round cheeks. Gray-blue eyes was Anna's mirror. She brushed Anna's hair back from her forehead, her hand lingering, feeling the pulse beneath. For the first time, she understood the girl's place was not only in her arms, but in the memory of a man the fort still honored. That night, Clara lay awake with Lydia curled at her side. Snow tapped against the shutters, soft as knuckles on a door. She felt the quiet between breaths and knew the fight was shifting. It was no longer about sickness or fear. It was about where these children belonged. The twist came when a letter arrived from the east. It bore the Army's seal, carried by a courier who had ridden hard across frozen plains. Sheriff Danner brought it to her himself, setting it on the table with a grave nod. Moore broke the seal while Clara watched. The paper trembled in his hand, though not from cold. The letter confirmed what he had pieced together. Anna Calloway was the sergeant's daughter, and by law she was heir to a small pension meant for his kin. The words carried more than money. They carried legitimacy. Proof that the girl was not an orphan adrift, but blood tied to the fort's history. Proof that Clara had not harbored plague, but a soldier's legacy. The news spread quick as prairie fire. By dusk, townsfolk who had once muttered against Clara now stood awkwardly at her fence. Hats in hand, some offered flour or wood. Others spoke apologies they could not finish. Clara accepted nothing more than a nod, though she let their words hang in the cold air like pennants. That Sunday, the pastor opened the church doors wider than before. Lydia sat in the front pew, Anna beside her, Samuel wrapped in blankets near the stove. Clara watched them all, her heart steady, her hand resting lightly on Lydia's shoulder. Yet not every face had softened. In the back pew, the farmer who had called for fire sat rigid, his jaw tight. He left before the hymn, his boots striking sharp on the floor. Some storms do not end, they move on to other horizons. For Clara, the storm had already reshaped her life. Each night she tucked the children close. Samuel's hand warm in hers, Lydia leaning against her side, Anna drifting to sleep with the doll pressed to her chest. Their nearness was both shield and anchor. Moore visited less after the letter, his duty complete in the eyes of the law. But whenever he came, his gaze lingered on the children longer than words allowed. Clara saw the promise there, though the papers might name their place. Their home remained where love had been risked and kept. By early February, the snow began to break into slush. Wagons cut deep ruts through the thawing ground. Life at the fort carried on, though quieter, humbled by what had nearly torn it apart. On a pale morning, Clara walked with Lydia down to the river. Ice still drifted in broken sheets, glinting against the sun. Lydia slipped her hand into Clara's, her fingers squeezing once, firm. "Are we safe now?" she asked. Clara bent, pressing her lips to the girl's temple. "We are safe as long as we stay together." The river carried its echoes away, but inside Clara's cabin, the sound of laughter began to return, soft at first, then strong enough to fill the rooms. And though the memory of fear would never leave Fort Kearny, the children under Clara's roof had carved out a place where mercy proved stronger than winter's grip. You've just heard another frontier story here on WestDream Tales. If this tale moved you, leave a comment, share it with a friend, and keep the campfire burning. There are more stories waiting on the trail, so subscribe and ride with us into the next legend. Until then, may your path be steady and your spirit strong.